and welcome. Thank you for popping in here. If you're new to my channel, please like and subscribe for me. Hit that notification bell if you find this helpful so that you don't miss out on the next video. Comment below with anything that you guys need help with or topics you'd like me to cover. Don't forget to check out my website, consultingninja.tech, and look at the resources section there. It's full of a whole bunch of free stuff that I've found helpful and hopefully you would find helpful as well. With that out of the way, we're going to get into some testing. We're going to be testing a React application. I set this up using Create React App, and so it comes with the dependencies required to do this. If you did not use that, then you're going to need to install testing library JSDOM, testing library React, and testing library user event. You will also need to create your own app.test.js and make sure that your package.json has a test script able to be ran to fire up your testing. If you used Create React App, all of that stuff will already be done for you, and you will have a skeleton app.test.js already here in your source directory for you. Looking at our app.js, you will see I've gutted this out, and all that is in here are 3 components inside of a div. The 3 components are navbar, home, and footer, and these are super basic. Just a div with a class name and the text that also corresponds to the component, and that's the same for home and for footer. Now, if you want to take a look at this, it looks like absolute biscuits, but we are not styling today, we're testing. So we don't really care what this looks like. The point is to be able to run some tests, and stick with me, you will be testing your React application shortly. Hopefully you guys have followed along so far. We are actually really close to already testing. Inside of our app.test.js, this is where the tests actually occur. This will be included, although yours will look slightly different in that the label for the test will be a little bit different, and it'll be looking for something slightly different here. Otherwise, this is exactly as you would see yours if you used Create React App to start it. So inside of our app.test.js, now this is what's considered a testing suite. Each individual file is a suite of tests, and for every test that you have in your suite, you need to have a separate function call like this. So we're going to have multiple tests inside of our suite. So let's go ahead and just copy and paste that 4 times. Now let's look at one of these quickly before we get much further. And a test looks like this. It is a function, and the function takes a couple of parameters. The first parameter is the name of the test. The next is the arrow function, an anonymous function, and here's where we get into the nitty-gritty of the actual test. In here is what you're doing for your test. The documentation for testing library React, if you look at that, and I highly recommend that you do, they essentially have every test broken up into 3 pieces. They have an arrange, an action, and an assertion. The arrange is where you're setting up the pieces of your application you're going to test. The action in more complicated tests would be the user action, and don't worry, I will do a video on those in the future. And our assertion is essentially what we're expecting to happen, and that's where we get this expect. So we have test. Render is rendering out this component in a browser environment. This variable here, we are using screen from testing library, and this is very similar to document, except this is only looking at what is visible to the user. And then get by text, there's many queries. All of this put together is called a matcher, and I don't really know why they call them matchers. They only do that when they're referring to testing. Otherwise, people would just call this query, but when it comes to testing, they call this a matcher. And there are other ones for screen, and in fact, we don't even have to use screen if we don't want to. We can use the old school document. So we can do a document.get element by ID, by class name, by name, tag name, whichever one you're most comfortable with. Let's go ahead, and since our app wrapper does not have any other distinguishing characteristics, let's use class name. And inside of here, what we're going to put is app, and that needs to match the class name that you're giving that component. And this portion is called the assertion, and this is where this is actually expect comes from Jest. Testing library uses it behind the scenes. I don't actually care for the fact that these aren't imported directly from Jest, because you can't hover over it to get that helpful IDE support for these. But essentially what's going on here is we have this expectation that this thing that you put inside of here is going to meet the dot whatever the requirement is. In our case, it's to be in the document, but there is actually a whole host of other expectations you can put. Just like there's other ways you can query, you can put many different expectations attached to your expect. So there is to contain HTML, to not be in the document, to be greater than 0, to contain the text, many different ones out there. Let's just keep things simple for the sake of this video here, and we'll just leave it as to be in the document. Now, the other thing that I'll point out before I move too much further is that you have to pay attention to what you're doing with your selectors, because this, if you hover over it, will tell you it's returning a collection, which means it's returning an array. And if you were to try to run this, it would say you'd get an error, essentially, because it's trying to run an expectation of an array on being in the document. So all we need to do to fix that is just access the first element in that array. And since there's only going to be one thing, and we know there's only going to be one thing, there's no problem there. So if I save this and we go look at our tests, in our terminal you need to run npm test. npm run test will run the script laid out in your package.json if you've used create react app, and it runs essentially like a development server but for testing. What that looks like is anytime you save a testing file that's in your suite or associated with any of your suites, it watches for those changes and will rerun your tests every time you make a change. So I already ran that. I'm just going to shut this off and I'll rerun this quick for you and clear. So npm run test, and you can see it firing up that test suite and goes through the tests, and then this is what it looks like. There's a lot going on here because we have 3 failing tests, but I'll break it down. Each suite has a source file. So up at the top we see this like summary of the suite, and it's the file that was ran, the test suite file that was ran, and then the tests that were contained in that suite. So for us, we have one suite and it had those 4 tests. That's why we needed to put each test in its own thing. You could render out just your app and then make all those same expectations, grabbing each piece inside of one test. However, it would make it less clear to anyone running your tests what's going on. So you should separate your tests for sake of clarity. And it tells you which one failed and why. So the first one, where we were using the class name to get the app, passed, and all the other 3 failed. So the first one that failed is, well, we didn't do a good job of changing our labels. Let's go change our labels and let this make more sense. So here, this would be our nav component. So let's change this to nav. Copy and paste that, and then we're looking for home. And here we're looking for footer. I'm going to update this to say navbar. This I'm going to update to say home. And this one I'm going to leave app. And I'm going to save this, and our test suite is going to run again. There it's going. And now you can see that after I've updated those, here we have those labels. And now you're starting to see why it makes sense to have each test separate, because you can label it, and now, wow, this is making much more sense as to what's going on. So we now have 3 passing tests, and they're all labeled correctly here. And the one that failed has a special amount of output that we see here. And it tells you what the name was, tells you the label, and it tells you why it failed. It also spits out some of the HTML surrounding that test. Now, we have a very small example, and so we're actually able to see the entire document here for us, the entire body. But in most cases, you won't be able to see all of it. But they do this because it's like, hey, you're looking for screen.getByText app, and there is no visible text in here to the user called app, right? A class is not visible to the user, and so this fails. And then we have, this is the line that failed inside of your file, and then at the bottom we have a summary of everything that happened. We have how many test suites failed out of how many total. We have how many tests in that suite were failed, passed, and then the total amount of those. How many snapshots, and this is again something I will cover in a future video. Snapshots are super helpful, and we'll get into those later. And then the time it took to run those tests. So if we go back to this file, our app.test.js, and we fix this screen.getByText to be footer, and we save and go back and look at our test suite again, you will see we now have 4 passing tests in our suite. Every single one of them passed successfully. Our suite passed, and everything was a-okay. So here we have a good example of testing. It's very basic, and I get that. However, if you can even implement this, you are taking a giant step forward into testing your application. So I highly recommend that you play around with this. Check out the documentation that exists for testing library React. There's much more that we can do with this, and we will do it in the future. I hope that you guys have found this video helpful. You now have tested an application. Implement this today in your own application. If you liked this, please give a thumbs up and consider subscribing. And as always, have a great day.